Okay, so I think we've gone through a lot of the basics for the female nomada, and now we want to talk about several species and species groups that are common. There's lots of uncommon ones, so I don't think we'll drill in too far on those unless people have specific questions, because a lot of my collection's at the Smithsonian right now, so I don't have the details. But um, let's start with Nomada depressa and the pseudopogidial area. Sorry, back here. Oh, there it is. So the pseudopogidial area is at the very last abdominal segment on the, see, I need to put this in the right place. Imbricata. It's on the last antennals, the last abdominal segment, upper part. On, I think they all have it. All females have this, and it's very variable, but often not in a way that's easy. I'm going to flip to my microscope now. Um, Not in a way that's easy to quantify, except for a couple of cases. And sometimes in very specific situations where you're trying to differentiate a small set of species, it can be used, and we'll use it verbally in terms of a description, but because it's difficult to describe and the features are very fine, it's almost always a secondary character. So there is a set, I think there's three species. I think one that we see regularly called Nomada depressa, and another, I want to say it's media, that is kind of ambiguous. Like, is it really a full species or not? I don't, I'm almost certain that I have never seen a specimen caught and identified. And a lot of times we run into these problems where something's on the books, particularly Mitchell, and we see that when we try to find or look at the holotype, it's a little ambiguous and the descriptions are a little vague, and nobody seems to have any in their collection. So these are a bunch of things that need to be resolved. But in some of those cases, they actually turn out to be rare but and legitimate um, species. So within this group of very, you'll see in Mitchell's key, and I'm not sure what we say in terms of our key, but there's a very long pseudopogidial area. So let me show that to you. Did I share yet? No, not yet. And what that looks like. So the pseudopogidial area, I suppose, and I don't know if this is well known or not, is associated with probably some kind of nest incursion activity by the females. I want to change that a little bit there. But if someone knows more about this, let's make this full screen. And let's get it in focus. Okay, so what we're looking at is a pretty standard looking Nomada, red with yellow dots. And from there, we could go lots of different directions. It could be a red CT kind of species, which this is within that group. We'll take a quick look and see if it does have the red CT on the labrum and the scape and the head. But once you, if you do a quick scan, as you probably should always do with a Nomada, and you look at its tail end at this pseudopogidial area, you'll see this or something along the lines of this. What's really going on here is the size and the proportion of the abdominal segment that this takes up. So this whole area right here is modified into what has been termed the pseudopogidial area. And when you start looking at these kinds of things, you'll see that the hairs that make up the pseudopygidial area, and normally it's just a strip. So and we'll show some of the next few species, we'll show the pseudopygidial areas. The hairs are just a strip along here, and some of them can be fat, some of them can be thin. These have thin ones like you would see on several different species on the edge, and the interior is this odd fur-like thing. Why? I don't know, but we have up to 3 species, one of which is just a Western counterpart of depressa, I believe, and the other is an ambiguous one that may or may not exist, if I also recall, but is also, I believe it's still in the Keys. Anyway, almost all the time, or all the time for me at least, when you see something like this, it's Nomada depressa in the east, and there's not really any question about it. So what you're looking at is, when we talk about a long pseudopygidial area, they vary, but almost never to this degree where they are taking up pretty much the entire segment in terms of that length. At most, a relatively long one compared to the others would be approaching halfway, and the hairs would be denser and whiter in general on those. And again, we'll show a couple. And some just have a relatively small fringe at the end. So this, though, what a great character, because it pretty much identifies what you want to see in a species, which is one character that is so obvious that you don't have any problems and you don't question what's going on. I want to jump to the head here and see if, and I can't remember, the male is definitely within of Nomada depressa, which is, I think, still undescribed, is definitely in the red CT group but what we're looking for, if you recall from last time, is very clear, upright, red hairs, CT really, that are sticking out beyond the paler hairs. Like, I very clearly see pale hairs here, and I'm not seeing anything that immediately jumps out. And I believe that's what I recall from this species, which is, it has aspects that are within that red-haired group, which is not a taxonomically defined group in terms of a subgenus or something. It's just one of those categories that are used, like bidentate and things like that, that are of convenience. I'm going to pump up the light. We'll take a quick look there, and then we'll move on to some other species. So let's jump this light up to 400 maybe. Yeah. So let's go back to a bigger screen. Recall that when we were talking about these red-haired species, there we go. We also said that there's an aspect to their face where you have a lot of dark integument, and the lighter integument tends to have this orangish, a certain kind of, or I don't know what the crayon description would be, but it's a certain coloration of a red orange in there. And this, again, is sort of in between and has aspects of that. But also, if you look at the hairs, they almost all look alike. So I'm not sure that the species, despite its very nice character, seems to be in an in-between state. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, because once you see that pseudopygidial area, you don't have any questions. I was just more curious for myself as to whether we have these red hairs, and I'm really not seeing any. So probably it's scored for both. Someone could check and tell us. Okay, so we're going to move on from this species, and we're going to go to some of the most common. So Nomada depressa is a regular occurrence, but it's not what I would call common. This group of larger Nomada rival the white CT and the bidentate groups, which are very common. in their commonness. And these are species that almost certainly are parasitizing some of the melandrina. Okay, too bright. And they all kind of, the ones that we're going to call, again, a natural grouping, all kind of look like this. So a lot of color. The abdomen here is almost always or always striped. Sometimes I believe on some specimens you can have a break here, so you have a partial stripe, and be aware that sometimes when you're looking at Nomada and you see, oh, it's a continuous stripe, if you look in the center, like see how it's pinched here? This is not, I would call this a continuous stripe. But in some, there would be a faint reddish line that essentially still separates the two into two segments. It might appear like if we come across one, I'll try and show it. It may appear to be a continuous line, but the actuality is there is some kind of break in the middle. So these are all very colorful along these lines, lots of reds and yellows, some black, but not a whole lot. And we're going to jump down to the pseudopygidial area because we were just talking about that and show that in contrast. Oh, sorry, this is Nomada imbricata. So we're going to talk about Nomada because these are the specimens I have. So in this group in the east, we have Nomada imbricata, Nomada luteoloides. These are the common ones. So almost any survey, particularly in woodlands and near woodlands, are going to run into these species. And the females are relatively easy to tell apart. And if you recall from a couple classes ago, what we saw was on the hind tibia, the CT that are there were the ones that were relatively fat and had been bent over, two or three large fat ones bent over following the rim. And that's distinct to those two. And then you tell the two apart, which we're going to do right now. But I want to show you the difference here with the pseudopygidial area. So here's the same segment from here to here is the same segment we saw in depressa, but in depressa, this entire area was modified into this pseudopygidial feature. But here you can see that this integument is similar in structure to the integument of the other tergites, but there exists, as I believe every Nomada has, a modified area of different kinds of CT. So you can see there's a bunch of things going on here, right? If you look very closely, there are some thicker CT here along the edge in the transition zone from the rim where you have this bright white CT, which again, most of the time, maybe all the time, they're bright white, and to the integument, and that these hairs that make up the pseudopygidial area, they appear to be blockier, much blockier than what we saw with the very fine hairs in depressa. So just gives you an idea. These things vary quite a bit of useful feature, but difficult to describe in terms of categories. So one of the things to think about in terms of its usefulness is when you're morpho sorting things and you have questions, am I looking at two different things or a similar thing? It's almost always useful to look at the pseudopygidial area and see if your hypothesis about two species is exposed in any way by parallel differences in the pseudopygidial area. Something that may be difficult to describe, but is something that you can clearly see under the microscope by eye. So, so here is the pygidial plate, which in the female is not very useful in terms of ID stuff. Mostly there's a sting, and there's always these hairs at the back. Again, these hairs are not used very much, and nor are the armatures that are associated with the sternites, I assume, down there. that different enough to be useful. But in the males, the pygidial plate is very useful and often quite dramatically different between species. So here we have this is a good angle, and what we're, so recall, we have the hind tibia, two bent over, red CT, very thick. That means it's luteoloides or imbricata. And the tricky part here is that the what was I going to try to say? Is that when you look at the overall specimen, when I look at the overall specimen, the ratios of these yellows, blacks, and reds can dial dramatically all over the place. So it's not, so like the more north you go, the more redder you'll see the specimens, and the more south you go, the darker. And a lot of times they sets of specimens will sort of overlap each other. Luteoloides tends to be on the darker side, as you'll see, but again, you can get an example of an imbricata that is just as dark and a luteoloide that is bright as all get out up in north. So the identifying feature here is pretty straightforward. What you're looking at, let's go through scutum, scutellum, metanotum, and here's a propodium, and here is the top of the propodium, very much bent over right now, or into, transitioning almost directly to the rear face of the propodium is a propodial triangle. So you can still make out these vaguely here, these suture lines. And what you see is that the yellow below makes it into that triangle. So there's yellow patches on either side of the triangle, and stuff's going on in the middle that seems to be very variable, whether it's black or dark and red. The importance is that there are big yellow, bright yellow, unambiguous yellow patches on either side of the triangle. And in luteoloides, which we'll park up here in a second, this is all black. There is no yellow up there. So let me show you luteoloides. Again, to Nomada, cruising around their nesting areas. Okay, so here's a good example. And let me get a thing here. I'll take off the label. So this bee has very little red, but up north, the same species could be very much red. And so we see, though, that the presentation, if we looked at the tibial CT, which is not going to bother, they're bent over and dark and thick on the hind tibia. So puts it in this class. You see these complete bands of yellow across the back, and you see that overall there's lots of maculations or color in the legs and elsewhere, but there's very little red in this particular one. So this would be a more southern individual. And we're going to zoom in here, but you can even from here see that the so scutellum, metanotum, propodial triangle, that propodial triangle is all black. So let's zoom in a little bit. So it's a pretty straightforward character, fortunately. And we'll show look at that, a sulphurata next, which is in the class. So I'm not going to zoom in any further, but you can see here that it does have big yellow patches, but they are bound by the suture lines that define the triangle area. That makes it so. So you don't have to look at any other kinds of characters for that. Common species. The trick is to not be fooled by the fact that northern populations can be just as brightly colored with reds, the inclusion of reds, as the southern populations are black. So in the north, imbricata slash leuteoloides look similar, but they still have that pattern. In the, oops, I'm going to pull out a sulphurata now. In the integument, on the propodial triangle. So sulphurata was basically the same size. This is a very old specimen. This is, let's see, where is this from? Powder Mill up in Pennsylvania. Looks like 1905. And it's also been chewed on by dermestids a little bit, but not enough to cause us to not be able to ID it. And I'm first going to show you, actually, let's just look at the pseudopygidial area. I forgot to do it on the other one, but while I'm thinking pseudopygidium, just to show that
you still got
there's differences.
up?
No, sorry, this is sulphurata. So I've moved on, a very old specimen. And, you know, maybe if you looked at a lot of them, you would see that there's some subtle differences in, for example, the reddish hairs here, a little bit perhaps different, and maybe something with the white hairs. If you're trying to discriminate, like, do I have a different species or the same? I'd look here because this seems to be an active area for differentiation. Okay, but certainly nothing like the depressa. So now we're going to go to the hind CT because while that visually that looks very similar to the sorry, I'm doing two things at once. Let me just get the proper angle on this. Very similar to our friends luteoloides and imbricata. It's not. This is a less common, but still around species. I think in some states it's listed as, let's call it species of concern, but I'm not concerned about it.
This is still sulphurata.
This is still sulphurata. And what we're dialing in on are the rear legs. And we're going for our CT area again. So if you recall, in in any of these, you have this projecting triangle area. That's sort of a reference. On the back side will be the spurs, the tibial spurs, and there is basically a straight area. This keeps going out of focus. A straight area from that edge to the opposite side that carries CT in different sorts of patterns. A lot of times it's like this, which are the CT are primarily crowded on the opposite edge or corner from the triangle. Well, it really does want to wander. Yeah. And but when you look here, you don't see any bent over CT. In fact, you see a jumble of several CT, starting here's 1, 2, 3, and then it gets hard to see. But if you start turning it around, you see multiple up to about 10 of the CT here. If we were looking at luteola, not luteoloides, you would also see even more CT in that area. And that's one of the ways of discriminating that species. I don't have an example with me, sadly, another day. So that tells us right away that despite the overall look, it would key out very rapidly because of the stripes on the abdominal segments to that species, you don't have it because the CT pattern on the hind tibia is so different. When looking at this species, a distinct general pattern that should jump out as a possible ID character is like you get in imbricata, you have yellow here, and this area here has this sort of hourglass look to it. I don't know if we even mentioned that, but it is a vibe of this particular species. But the CT pattern is a key, as are the patterns on the head, but the head has been chewed on enough that I can't really show you much of anything I think that's useful there. You'll see, for example, that there is a very carinate edge to the cheek, and that if we are to imagine, it seemed like this particular dermestid larvae was a grazer. Oh, look, you can see the inside of its head. But these ratios of antennal segments are quite different. And I'm not quite remembering, but I believe that in luteola, the carinate rim of the cheek has a, I think it's in the females, I want to say that's right, has a, is translucent and see-through and quite a degree more pronounced than in any of these other species. I think there's a couple other things that have to do with maybe some coloration patterns, but that may be more in the males for that group. Anyway, I've been putting off Nomada for a long time, hoping that I got my specimens back, but it looks like it's still many months away. And we want to talk about these groups. So I'm going to put this away. I'm going to bring out now another one that we have spoken about, but we did not show in the last ones. And I guess I'll show the top side first. So this is Nomada maculata. So Nomada maculata is, again, a very common species, and the class that it sits in are the bidentate toothed species. So there's a tooth making the tip mitten-like that is above the top of the mandible and edge, whereas all the other Nomada have simple blade-like structures, so there's no tooth on there. And so all the other species groups within the bidentate group, I don't identify, just call it bidentate group, except for maculata. And it's got a general pattern that I think yields a good identification, and there doesn't seem to be ambiguity. I could be wrong in the molecular stuff that we were looking at back in the day. So here's the pseudopygidial area. Let's go in there. Let's look at that pseudopygidial area and see if it is very different from luteola and imbricata ones. And there we go. And we'll zoom right in. So these are, in theory, quite different groups. And we see a very similar pattern. So here are the white hairs along the rim, a transition with some yellow or reddish hairs. They look finer to me than the other one did, but again, very difficult to really come up with a consistent classification, but potentially useful in comparative work. But now that we're down here on T6, immaculata often has this pattern where there are two circular, large yellow areas on that abdominal segment. These other segments have somewhere between a patch and a linear but broken in the middle line of yellow. These are always the kinds of things you have to be a little bit wary of in terms of being definitive. And then T1 has no yellow in it because it seems like somewhere there in the codex of their genomes, sometimes this amount of yellow gets dialed way up and they move towards a stripe, and other times it gets dialed way back. And in the extreme of Nomada diversity in a species, you can see nothing. They might not have any yellow markings at all. My impression is in this group that this is largely the same pattern. And I believe that pull this back, that the scutellum most of the time is what I would call pillow-like, meaning that there's not a sharp depressed area in the center. Like a lot of Nomada, you'll see a mound here, a mound there, and then a trough in between. And in maculata, it's much more uniform. The whole thing reminded me somewhat of a pillow. So otherwise, it's again a very generic looking thing with the typical patterns of reds, blacks, and yellows, marking it as Nomada, but not in a very useful way. So now we're going to go to the key character. I just want to make sure I can line it up well here on in the scope, because it's still something that requires a little putzing when you have it in hand to see, because you have to get it at the right orientation. So we're looking again at that back hind tibia. This is a little bit from the side, such that you can see the tibial spurs back here coming off. Let me move that into the center. And we're going to jack it as far as we can. So this is slightly different than what we've seen other times, but here to orient, there's the pulled out triangular corner, let's call it, of the integument on the outward facing face of the tibia, hind tibia. And then you have in the classic presentation, you have two CT, and this one is more difficult to see, but they're basically like parens. So they are bent towards each other in a parenthetical way. This one is shot sort of straight down, so you don't see the parenthetical parts of it. The outer one, so by that I mean the one on the farther side, away from the triangle, is fatter and thicker and usually a darker red, and you notice it more often. So it's very dark red, very noticeable, thick CT. And then there is this lighter one, both in terms of its thickness and aspect, and also its coloration. It can be more of a somewhere between translucent and rose colored. And together, that's a really classic. Now, sometimes you get like two CT here instead of just the one. And sometimes you don't see the other one. It's hard to tell what's going on, whether they're broken off or it's just like the kind of variation that we expect out of Nomada. And you can see here, like a lot of the CT are on the opposite side of first start on the opposite side. And indeed, that is there. But this one's about halfway or more than halfway towards the tip. But that's just classic maculata. And I know I have no evidence that other species do this kind of thing. You will see in the bidente group dark red CT all the time, but they tend to be, I would call them like cat's claws. So there'll be a whole series, they're straight but curved towards the rear, like and all parallel to one another, and almost never just two, but it's a series, the longest one being out here, and then shorter, but again, in a very uniform pattern of equally spaced CT. So that is that. So I've got a bunch of other specimens around. I can list them and we can look at them if that are female. But I'm also wondering if anyone, let's see, where did I put this? This goes back to here. If anyone has any questions at this point, or they want me to review something specifically on some females, you want to see something else, I'll show a couple other groups that unless, again, there's something that you want to see, a couple other groups of Nomada that are more common, not absent from the east, but more common to the west. And but I'm also listening to see if there's something that people are interested in talking about.
There's nothing to chat yet. Welcome to unmute, but I don't really understand what you were saying about the pseudophagial CT. Can we do like direct comparisons rather than, several pictures away trying to remember what they look like?
Okay,
Because you were saying it's like a vibe check, but you need to like have other ones next to you.
okay. Let's see if we can set that up on the same block here. We'll use, okay,
It's a small group today, so free to unmute if you got
right.
other conversations to have.
Oh, these are all males. They have some weird species, but males. So males have no pseudophagidial area. Lots more males. That doesn't even have an abdomen. Here. All right, so we'll line up on here a composita. I'll just do two at a time, maybe. And so you can see, like, compare and contrast. Just want to get the angle right of composita, which is one of the red-haired groups. And here's Pygmaea again. Make sure I have a female, and I do not. And this one is, okay. So we'll line up these two. They're about the same size, and they superficially look very similar, but they have very different architectures of the lovely little pseudophagidial area. Just want to get the angle right. Okay. So dial this down here a bit. Maryland, crazy. Oh, did I knock this one around a little bit? I might have. That still's probably going to be okay. I think. All right, so we're looking at composita here. I want to change the angle a little bit more, but you already can see if you were thinking about the other species that, oh, that looks different. Maybe. It's all a bunch of nuance. Okay, so we're contrasting composita here on the left, and I'm going to take a look here. I guess the main thing to look at is the pattern and shape of the white hairs in this case. Other times that basal, in this case, I don't even see really, we're at our max. I don't really see transitional CT at all. I just see long white hairs here. Very similar to some other white hairs and not much that I would call different about it. Now let's move over, and also, so there's different thickness, different lengths involved, shorter here, longer here, and a little bit difficult to tell how much of the area of the end is in the state. Okay, look at that. It's very close to being the same. Now we're looking at Pygmaea. Again, we're at our max, but you can see here, and again, you can see why it's difficult to describe this. Whereas looking at it, you can see like, okay, these hairs are blockier. I think if we actually, so I'm at the max of my magnification, that sort of would be the expectation that most people's scopes are not going a whole lot higher than this. This is not a special scope in terms of magnification. But you can see that what appears to be blunted, wider hairs that are clearly different in their morphology from the hairs to either side. So contrast these white hairs, which look similar to what we saw in composita, and we'll go back to composita again, with the pseudopygidial hairs, would look very modified in their fatness. If I can really get this magnification going here. I think we're at the limits. Yeah.
Someone's asking what specifically are you at?
This is Pygmaea.
No, I mean magnification.
Oh, let's see. We are at 5, and I believe these are 10x's, so we're going to be at 50. Is that right? Yeah. And that's pretty standard. So most stereo microscopes would have a 10x objective. So those are things you park your eyeballs on. And the variable magnification would run up to somewhere like 50, 60 if it's, I would say, on the better of the medium range microscopes. And it would go maybe, I think, like I want to say the Bosch and Lomb, the standard student scopes that are still around and all over the place. We've got a bunch. I think those might only go up to 3.5, so that would be 35x. I'm not 100% sure about that. And they probably vary too. And you can do, and we've done that, so you can swap out the oculars with these, they simply pull out. So when you're cleaning them, you can see these kinds of things, and you can slide back in other oculars that have higher magnification. So you can get 20x, 15x is a good compromise. The trick is then your field of view becomes less. At least this is my impression. So in general, I've stuck with the 10x because I want to see more of the specimen in my field of view. But options are there. You can have them. You can buy if you got some extra change, end of the year money, you can get the 15x oculars for your scope and then swap them in and out. It's actually pretty quick to do, and then you just keep them in their little case if you want. So pseudopygidial, and then you look at this transition area, and there seems to be more of a transition. But again, we're kind of at the limits of our resolution of the microscope. There do appear to be slightly different lines here, but different from what we were looking at in the imbricata luteoloides crowd. Now we'll go back and take a look here at the composita, again, just in contrast, now that you've spent a bunch of time looking at these things.
I think having them next to each other has helped.
Okay.
As you share your wisdom, David wants to confirm, is it true that there's no practical key for Western specimens? Are we just stuck with morpho species, whatever?
I know of none. And I don't know, maybe Catherine is working on Western stuff, but I don't even know anyone who is working on Western Nomada at the moment. There's been keys developed for a couple of the groups. So again, depending on who you talk to and who you believe and how you think about subgenera, there are a couple, which I don't recall because I really don't do Western stuff. My mind is just too small. But I'm going to say no, there is not. And you would end up like going back 100 years to some of the literature that maybe Cockerell put together. But a lot of times the other way is to travel to Logan, Utah, and just do direct comparisons with their specimens on some of these and then put a name on it and hope it was retained. Or you can start visiting and looking at types and create your own key and discover life, and you would be everyone's hero. I think there's, in general, there's patterns of species ID that are sort of known by Western practitioners, but I don't know how they're getting them except by traveling amongst themselves and visiting museums, which is another value for museums. Okay, let me put, unless there's more questions there with these two, I'm going to move them back to their parking spot so I don't forget where they go. It's a delightful group, just like a lovely little puzzle to work on these things. And what do we got here? This is Pygmaea. Again, when I say Pygmaea, I really mean Pygmaea group, because there's more than one thing in there, that's for sure. Okay, so I think that is all I'm going to do for, we're just looking, do a quick scan over some of these things. For these groups right at the moment. Just going back. I keep seeing these things, and then of course I don't have them on hand, but in our new, oh, we can look at the micro. So again, a name that you'll run into is micronomada rather. And there is a manuscript floating around by Snelling on that group. And we did, with Molly Reitmeyer, we did a little revision of some of the Eastern, two of the Eastern ones, and a bunch of, I mean, it was really delightfully complicated with males being misassociated with females and names being having to be moved around. But it's useful to take a look at this group and get a vibe on it. So let me put in a couple species on here. They tend to have long CT. Maybe we could look at F. habilis too. No, we looked at that already. So let me get the microandrina ones. Let me get another one or two here. I guess they should be pulling the females rather than, but the males look very similar. Oh, we can look at pseudopygidiolaria on that one too. Yeah, these two are different things, Western, so I'm not going to pretend to know what they are. Very different aspects, but this vibe is a micro andrina or nomada vibe, which is very dark on the front, stripes usually on the back. Ugh, what did I do there? A lot of them are associated with agapostumums and much more common out west. Not all. And it's a little bit difficult to describe. I'm sure that Snelling had some reason that he would differentiate this group from the others. But they do, I think one of the things is that we've seen is that there's a long spine in the front coccyx. I'll show that because I don't know that we documented that. And that's one of the ways, and they usually have very smooth transitioning cheeks. So let's look at the pseudopygidial of these. Some could be quite light colored. Again, just to show difference. There's different things out there in the pseudopygidial land. So here, it's a little bit of a oblique angle here, but you can see, again, that what you have in most places is a band of blocky white hairs making up the rim. Nothing particularly special there, but here we transition in the back part to areas that have more transitional hairs, and there's some dark integument behind it. And it's hard to tell whether the hairs are dark colored, yellow colored, perhaps, or just translucent and showing the integument behind it. But you can see that those hairs are much higher density, right? You don't see that up in the remainder of the segment, are very, very thin. And this proportion of these white areas is relatively large compared to, say, the Pygmaea group thing we saw. Now let's look at the one next to it. And I think I got it here. And see a similar but different version. So here again, lots of dark hairs. It's a little bit dirty because it's a very old specimen. I've got to see this myself a little bit better. But quite different hair patterns. So first of all, there's no clearly bright white things. It's possible these are bright white and these have somehow been gooped up. But it's more, and they seem to be wider in some ways and brighter. And then here is so here's the rim of the second one. And it seems like this whole area up to here has been modified. There's hairs on the sides that are quite different. So very different aspect to, and then I'm not clear what's going on here, but these hairs are quite dramatic.
That is a more common Western characteristic, or you're just showing us an example of that